crowd through the forward operating base command tent like broken glass against concrete. Captain Marks Reeves pressed his palm against the radio, as if proximity had somehow injured the impossible. The transmission had cut out 17 minutes ago, leaving nothing but white noise and the taste of defeat settling in his throat like desert sand. Outside, the temperature gauge read 42 degrees Celsius, but inside the tent, ice seemed to flow through everyone's veins. "We've got maybe 18 hours of water left," Staff Sergeant Torres reported, his voice carrying the weight of mathematics that spelled doom. "Food ran out the morning, metal supplies." He didn't finish the sentence. Everyone knew. Studied the map spread across the makeshift table, red pins marking any position that had tightened around their isolated outpost like a noose. They'd been cut off for 6 days now, ever since the supply convoy had been ambushed 40 clicks south. The official channels had gone silent. Higher command had written them off, chalking up another forward position to the brutal arithmetic of war. 3:47 hours, something impossible happened. A sound cut through the pre-dawn darkness that made every soldier in the compound freeze mid-breath. It wasn't the familiar whine of incoming artillery or the distant rumble of any armor. It was something else entirely, a low, throaty growl that seemed to emerge from the stars themselves. Corporal Davies was the first to spot it, a dark silhouette moving against the constellation of Orion like a predatory bird hunting in the night. "Aircraft inbound," he whispered into his radio, though his voice carried a confusion that infected everyone who heard it. "Bearing 270 altitude. Christ, it's coming in low." A-10 Thunderbolt materialized from the blackness as if conjured by desperation itself. Its twin engines whispered death, but tonight they sang salvation. The aircraft's distinctive profile, ugly by conventional standards, beautiful by the measure of those who understood its purpose, banked hard left in a approach pattern that defied every regulation in the book. Radio contact, no identification friend or foe responder signal, no advance warning through field channels, just a ghost made of titanium and determination, carrying something that would change everything. As wooden crate began falling from its belly on precision parachutes, Captain Reeves realized that someone somewhere had decided his men were worth saving after all. The question that would haunt him for years to come was simple. First light of dawn cut the retreating aircraft's exhaust trail, a silver thread connecting Earth ahead. And in that moment, Marks Reeves understood that miracles sometimes wore the calling of pilots nobody talked about in the official after-action reports. Catalina Reaper, Voss had earned her call in the hard way, through precision that bordered on supernatural and a kill record that made seasoned pilots uncomfortable during briefings. But tonight, 30,000 feet above the Hindu Kush Mountains, she wasn't hunting enemy targets. She was defying direct orders, risking court-martial, and possibly ending her 15-year career over a radio transmission that had lasted exactly 42 seconds. It hadn't come through field channels. Instead, it had crowded through an emergency frequency that most pilots assumed was defunct, transmitted by a forward air controller whose voice carried the hollow exhaustion of men who had counted their final hours. Any station, this is Vipers of Actual. We are Winchester on everything. Say again, Winchester on everything, if anyone can hear this. His men had cut to static, but Voss had memorized every coordinate, every inflection of desperation. She'd been returning from a routine patrol mission, her A-10's pylons empty except for the emergency supply drops she'd requisitioned for training purposes, a lie that would probably destroy her career if discovered. Hands moved across the aircraft's controls with the fluid precision of someone who had learned to fly before he'd learned to drive. The A-10 wasn't glamorous like the F-22s or elegant like the F-16s. It was a flying tank built around a can, designed to take punishment and keep fighting. Like her, it had earned respect through competence rather than charm. "This is Crystal Palace. Report your position and status." The voice from command cut through her headset with bureaucratic authority. Voss adjusted her radio frequency slightly, introducing just enough static to make her response unintelligible. "Crystal Palace, Reaper. Experiencing radio difficulties. Continuing patrol route Delta 7. It was exactly a lie. She was experiencing radio difficulties, with telling the truth. The supply drops she carried contained metal supplies, MREs, water purification tablets, and ammunition that had been borrowed from 3 different supply depots through creative paperwork and favors owed from her time as an instructor pilot. PS coordinates burned in her memory like a brand. 37 degrees, 14 minutes north. 70 degrees, 48 minutes east. A dot on the map that represented 53 soldiers who had been forgotten by everyone except the pilot who had once been forgotten herself. Flecken stared back from the candy glass, guarded by a piece of shrapnel that had found its way through her helmet during a close air support mission 2 years ago. The doctors had offered plastic surgery, but she kept the reminder of how thin the line was between coming home and becoming a statistic. Aim below shifted from bare mountains to scattered settlements as Voss descended through the darkness, her aircraft's engines throttled back to minimize noise. Every training manual, every regulation, every protocol screamed against what she was doing. Solo night operations in hostile territory without backup or official sanction violated so many rules that she stopped counting. Rules had never saved her life in the cockpit. Instinct had. Trust in her aircraft had. The willingness to act when action was required had kept her alive through 97 combat missions, and tonight it might keep 53 strangers alive as well. Radar warning receiver remained silent, a small mercy in hostile airspace. The enemy apparently wasn't expecting aircraft at that hour, in the location, conducting operations that didn't officially exist. Voss had chosen her approach route carefully, threading between known surface-to-air middle sites like a needle through filler. "Let that be the right place," she whispered into the darkness, though he'd never been particularly religious. Prayer was something that happened naturally at altitude, when the line between earth and sky became a negotiation with forces beyond human control. Forward operating base appeared below as a cluster of lights that seemed pathetically small against the immensity of the Afghan landscape. Through her night vision, she could see the perimeter, the defense positions, the harsh geometry of survival carved into hostile terrain. It looked exactly like the 100 other forward operating bases she'd supported over her career, and exactly like the one she'd never forget. First deployment. Her first real combat mission. Her first time watching good people die because supplies hadn't arrived in time. She'd been a lieutenant then, flying Copeland in a transport helicopter, watching helplessly as soldiers rationed medicine that couldn't be rationed, as men died from treatable wounds because bureaucracy moved slower than blood loss. Sworn that night that she would never be helpless again, that she would never let distance and paperwork decide who lived and who died. It had been a naive promise, made by someone who still believed the system worked for people who followed the rules. 15 years later, she was keeping that promise in the only way she knew how, by breaking every rule that mattered to everyone except the people who were about to receive supplies that didn't exist, delivered by a pilot who was supposed to be there. East Point was 30 seconds away, and Catalina Voss began her final preparations for an airdrop that would either save lives or end her career. Black crates fell through the pre-dawn darkness with mathematical precision, their parachutes blooming like mechanical flowers against the scattered sky. Voss had calculated the wind patterns, the drop altitude, the forward throw required to place each container within the bay perimeter. Physics and experience guided each rate toward its target with the accuracy that had earned her reputation among forward air controllers who had learned to trust her judgment over their own eyes. Reeves watched from the command post as wooden boxes materialized from nowhere, thumbing into the compound's central area with impacts that sounded like salvation. His radio operator, Corporal Kim, had given up trying to establish communication with the aircraft that had appeared without warning and was now disappearing without explanation. The aircraft is maintaining radio silence, Kim reported, his voice carrying a mixture of confusion and gratitude. No response on end frequency. His night vision scope, Reeves tracked the A-10 as it climbed away from the drop zone, its twin engines creating a sound signature that would fade into memory long before dawn. The pilot had maintained perfect discipline, no unnecessary radio chatter, no deviation from the mission profile, no evidence that could be traced back to field channels. Sergeant Torres was already supervising the recovery of the supply containers, his earlier despair transformed into the purposeful energy of soldiers who had been granted unexpected time. Medical supplies, sir. Antibiotics, morphine, battlefield dressing. Enough for 2 weeks, May 3 if we're careful. The crate yielded MREs and water purification tablets. The third contained ammunition for their M4 carbines and machine gun emplacement. Someone had understood exactly what they needed, had risked everything to provide it, and had asked for nothing in return except the chance to make a difference that would never appear in official reports. Studied the parachute scattered across the compound, white silk, that would have to be buried before sunrise to avoid attracting any attention. But for now, they represented something more valuable than concealment. They were proof that someone remembered that soldiers were more than map coordinates and casualty statistics. Please get those chutes policed up before first light, he ordered. Torres, I want inventory reports on everything within the hour. Kim, maintain radio watch on all frequencies, if our guardian angel needs anything. Didn't finish the sentence, but every soldier understood. Whoever had risked court-martial to deliver supplies to a forgotten outpost had earned loyalty that transcended rank and regulation. In the hard mathematics of military life, some debts could never be repaid, only honored through survival and remembrance. The eastern horizon was beginning to show the first hints of dawn as Reeves watched the last trace of the A-10's exhaust trail fade into the darkness. Tomorrow would bring any contact, political complications, and questions from higher command that would be difficult to answer without compromising their unknown benefit. Miles southwest, Voss leveled her aircraft at cruising altitude and allowed herself the luxury of steady breathing for the first time in 2 hours. The mission had been executed flawlessly, supplies delivered, no any contact, no compromise of friendly position. But the hardest part lay ahead, returning to base and pretending that nothing extraordinary had occurred during a routine patrol mission. Fuel gauge showed enough remaining for a comfortable return to Bagram Airfield, where she would file a standard mission report that mentioned equipment checks, communication testing, and reconnaissance of known enemy position. The truth would remain buried in the classified portions of her personal log, the place where pilots recorded the missions that mattered most and were discussed least. Radio crowded to life with routine traffic, other aircraft checking in with controllers, maintenance requests, weather updates. The war continued its relentless rhythm, indifferent to individual acts of conscience or courage. But somewhere behind her, 53 soldiers were beginning a new day with resources they hadn't possessed 6 hours ago, and that knowledge was worth the risk she had accepted. Hands were steady on the controls now, the adrenaline of the unauthorized mission fading into the professional satisfaction of problems solved through action rather than discussion. She had learned long ago that the most important decisions were often made in solitude, at altitude, when the clarity of consequences outweighed the complexity of regulation. Passed below in silence, ancient and indifferent to the small dramas of human conflict. But among those peaks, in a forward operating base that existed on maps but not in memory, soldiers were conducting inventory on supplies that had appeared like answered prayers, delivered by a pilot whose identity they would never learn and whose sacrifice they could never fully repay. Suggested her heading toward home base, where she would land, taxi to her assigned parking spot, and submit reports that would become footnotes in the endless bureaucracy of military operations. But in the secret letter where pilots recorded the missions that defined their careers, tonight's entry would occupy a place of honor. The night she had chosen conscience over career, action over approval, and the welfare of strangers over the comfort of following orders. The sky was brightening as Bagram Airfield appeared on the horizon, its runway lights a welcome sight after hours of flying through hostile territory. Soon, she would be debriefed, dismissed, and forgotten by everyone except the soldiers who would never know her name but would never forget the sound of her engines in the darkness. Later, the official after-action report would list the successful defense of forward operating base represent, a testament to exceptional leadership, tactical innovation, and the resilience of American forces operating in challenging conditions. Captain Marks Reeves would receive a Bronze Star for his leadership during the siege. Staff Sergeant Torres would be recommended for promotion. The entire unit would be cited for exemplary performance under extreme circumstances. Or would not mention the midnight supply drop that had provided the medical supplies to treat wounded soldiers, the ammunition that had enabled sustained defensive operation, or the water purification tablets that had prevented diarrhea casualties during the subsequent siege. Official records would show that the forward operating base had been resupplied through normal logistics channels, despite the fact that every supply convoy in the region had been suspended due to any activity. Discrepancy would be noted by a junior intelligence analyst named Lieutenant Serchen, whose job involved reconciling supply manifests with operational reports. She would spend 3 days attempting to identify the source of the mysterious supplies before being reassigned to different duties, a superior who explained that some questions were more dangerous than their answers. Notes would disappear in classified archives, joining thousands of other reports that documented the gap between official narratives and operational reality. But the intelligence analyst had developed a theory that she shared with no one. Someone with access to military supplies and aircraft had conducted an unauthorized mission to support isolated forces, risking court-martial to prevent tragedy that would never be officially acknowledged. The theory was correct. Major Catalina Voss had returned from her routine patrol to face no question more challenging than standard post-flight inspection. Her fuel consumption had been within acceptable parameters for the reported flight profile. Her aircraft showed no unusual wear or damage. Her mission report contained no irregularities that would attract administrative attention. 3 days later, she had been approached by Colonel James Harrison, the wing commander whose reputation for protecting his pilots was matched only by his intolerance for unnecessary risk. Their conversation had lasted exactly 7 minutes and had never been repeated. I've been reviewing fuel consumption reports for last week's patrol mission, Harrison had said, studying documents that Voss couldn't see. Interesting patterns in navigation and fuel usage. almost as if someone had deviated from assigned routes to conduct unauthorized operations. Haas had maintained the neutral expression that pilots learned to wear when facing potential career-ending conversation. "Sir, I completed all assigned mission objectives within specified parameters." And had nodded slowly, his eyes conveying understanding that his words couldn't express directly. "I'm sure you did, Mayor. I'm also sure that any unauthorized operation would represent serious violation of standing orders." He had paused, letting the weight of potential consequences settle between them. "Fortunately, I see no evidence of such operation in any official reports." Conversation had ended with Harrison filing Voss's mission reports without further investigation, but not before delivering a warning wrapped in paternal concern. "Mayor, you've built an exceptional career through skill, dedication, and sound judgment. Don't compromise that record by taking risks that exceed the potential benefits." His advice had been clear: help when possible, but never at the expense of a career that allowed her to help others. It was the delicate balance that defined military service, the tension between individual conscience and institutional loyalty, between immediate action and long-term effectiveness. Haas had accepted the warning without argument, understanding that Harrison's protection came with expectations of discretion that she had already violated once. Future decisions would require more careful consideration of consequences that extended beyond a single mission or a single unit in distress. Late at night, in the privacy of her quarters, she allowed herself the satisfaction of knowing that 53 soldiers had survived, because someone had been willing to risk everything when it mattered most. The official records would never acknowledge her contribution, but the absence of casualty reports from forward operating base Vipercent hold a story that vindicated every risk she had accepted. Personal log contained a single entry for that night: routine patrol, no ending contact, all objectives completed. The truth existed in the spaces between official words, in the silence that protected everyone involved, in the understanding that some victories could only be celebrated in private. Learned something important about herself during those hours of flying through hostile territory. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear when action was required. Leadership wasn't about following orders, but about accepting responsibility for consequences that others couldn't or wouldn't accept. Some would shape every decision she made during the remainder of her deployment, creating a reputation for reliability that had nothing to do with following procedures and everything to do with getting results when results mattered most. Forward air controls would request her specifically for difficult mission, trusting judgment that had been proven in circumstances they would never fully understand. Coulson, Reaper, would evolve from a reference to her precision in combat to something deeper: recognition of her role as the pilot who appeared when hope was dying, who delivered salvation when salvation seemed impossible, who accepted risks that others couldn't imagine for people she would never meet. Formation was subtle but complete. She had become something more than a pilot executing a assigned mission. She had become a guardian angel operating in the gray spaces between authorization and necessity, between rules and results, between career and conscience. Months later, Captain Reeves received orders transferring him to staff position at division headquarters, where his experience with isolated operations would contribute to improved logistic planning. The promotion was accompanied by a commendation that cited his exceptional leadership during challenging circumstances, his innovative approach to resource management, and his unit's perfect mission completion record despite operating in contested territory. His final briefing, Reeves had been asked to identify lessons learned that could benefit future operations. His recommendations focused on communication protocols, supply chain redundancy, and the importance of maintaining morale during extended isolation. He did not mention the midnight supply drop that had made survival possible, understanding that some lessons could not be shared without compromising the people who had made them possible. The question that had haunted him since that night remained unanswered: who had risked everything to save his unit? The investigation he had conducted through unofficial channels had yielded no useful information. The pilot had maintained perfect operational security, leaving no traces that could be followed by grateful soldiers or investigating authorities. Reeves carried with him a debt that could never be repaid, and a story that could never be told. In quiet moments, usually late at night when the weight of command decision pressed against his consciousness, he would remember the sound of twin engines in the darkness and the sight of parachutes blooming against the star-filled sky. Marie had become a talisman against despair, proof that individual action could change outcomes when collective systems failed. It had influenced every leadership decision he made, every risk assessment he conducted, every moment when he had to choose between regulations and results. The position would give him influence over supply operations across multiple theaters, an opportunity to ensure that other isolated units received the support they needed through field channels rather than midnight miracles. It was a chance to institutionalize the compassion that had saved his command, to transform individual courage into systematic care. And he wasn't lost on him. He had been promoted because of exceptional performance that had only been possible through actions that violated every protocol he would now be responsible for enforcing. The contradiction was uncomfortable but not uncommon in military service, where the gap between a field policy and operational reality required constant navigation, leaders who understood that success was more important than strict adherence to procedure. His final night at forward operating base Vipercent, Reeves had stood in the same position where he had watched the mysterious A-10 disappear in the dark months earlier. The constellation of Orion occupied the same position in the sky, but everything else had changed. His unit was healthy, resupplied, and preparing for transfer to less dangerous assignments. Ours offered no answers to questions that would follow him throughout his career, but they provided perspective that was both humbling and inspiring. Somewhere in the vast network of military operations, pilots were making decisions that would determine whether soldiers lived or died, whether missions succeeded or failed, whether the impossible be impossible through courage that couldn't be acknowledged in official reports. Catalina Voss continued flying missions that appeared routine in every report and debriefing, but her reputation among ground forces had acquired qualities that transcended her technical skills. Forward air controllers spoke of her with respect that bordered on reverence, though none could articulate exactly why she inspired such confidence. Approach to close air support had evolved beyond textbook precision, something more intuitive, more responsive to the subtle indicators of units under pressure. She had developed an ability to read between the lines of radio communication, to understand when standard requests for air support concealed desperate needs that couldn't be expressed directly. Authorized supply drop had taught her to look beyond min parameters to min purpose, to consider not just what was officially requested, but what was actually needed. This perspective had made her more effective in conventional operations, where the difference between adequate support and exceptional support often determined the outcome of ground engagements. Kill record continued to grow, but statistics captured only the most visible aspects of her contribution to the war effort. The missions that mattered most, the ones where her presence had prevented disasters rather than inflict casualties, remained unquantified and largely unrecognized by the systems that measured military effectiveness. Learned to find satisfaction in result rather than recognition, in the absence of friendly casualties rather than the presence of enemy losses. It was a mature understanding of success that came from accepting responsibility for outcomes that extended beyond individual performance metrics. So the log had become a record of decisions made in the gray spaces between authorization and necessity, between standard procedures and exceptional circumstances. Each entry was brief, factual, and carefully edited to protect people whose safety depended on operational security that she controlled absolutely. Between the lines, in the careful selection of details and the deliberate omission of others, the log told a story of transformation from pilot who followed orders to leader who understood that following orders was sometimes the enemy of accomplishing mission. Midnight Supply Drop had been a catalyst for change that affected every subsequent mission, every interaction with ground forces, every decision about when rules could be bent and when they had to be broken. A year after the incident at Forward Operating Base 5%, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison received a classified report that would remain buried in intelligence archives for decades. The report, prepared by a team of analysts investigating irregular supply activities, had identified patterns suggesting unauthorized logistics operations conducted by unknown personnel using military assets. Staging had been thorough but ultimately inconclusive. Fuel consumption records showed minor discrepancies that could be explained by navigation errors or weather conditions. Supply manifests contained gaps that could be attributed to clerical errors or retroactive adjustment. Aircraft maintenance logs revealed no unusual wear patterns that would indicate unauthorized operation. Significantly, no personnel had been identified as suspects. The investigation had focused on opportunity and access, but had failed to establish motive or intent sufficient to justify formal charges against any specific individuals. The analysts had concluded that, while unauthorized operations had probably occurred, proving such operations would require resources that exceed the potential benefits of prosecution. Some read the report with the detached interest of an administrator reviewing routine intelligence summaries. He initialed the cover page, indicating that the report had been reviewed by appropriate command authority, and filed it in the classified archives, where it joined thousands of other documents that raised more questions than they answered. Signature effectively ended any formal investigation into the incident, though he suspected that informal interest would continue among intelligence personnel, whose job required them to solve puzzles that others preferred to leave unsolved. The decision to close the investigation had been easy. Prosecuting unauthorized humanitarian operations would send precisely the wrong message to personnel whose initiative and judgment were central to mission success. Sun also understood that his protection of whatever pilot had conducted the midnight supply drop came with responsibilities that extended beyond administrative discretion. Future incidents would be more difficult to dismiss, particularly if they occurred frequently enough to establish patterns that could not be attributed to coincidence or clerical error. It was delicate, maintaining enough institutional flexibility to allow exceptional actions when circumstances warranted them, while preventing such actions from becoming routine violations of established procedures. It required leadership that could distinguish between necessary initiative and dangerous freelancing, between acceptable risk and reckless endangerment. Meeting with Mayor Voss months earlier had been part of that balance, a warning delivered with enough subtlety to protect both their careers while establishing clear expectations about future conduct. She had received the message, and as far as he could determine, had modified her behavior accordingly. Subsequent performance had been exemplary by every measurable standard. Her mission completion rate remained perfect. Her accuracy during close air support operations had improved. Her fuel consumption had fallen within normal parameters for all assigned missions. Most importantly, no additional supply irregularities had been detected in any theater where she was operating. So considered the conversation a successful exercise in leadership, guidance delivered with enough clarity to modify behavior, while preserving the initiative and judgment that made her valuable to ground forces who depended on close air support. The art of military command often involved knowing when to see and when to look away, when to enforce regulations, and when to protect the people who occasionally violated those regulations for the right reason. Her own career had been built on similar calculation, on the recognition that exceptional results sometimes required exceptional methods couldn't be officially acknowledged. The pilots who made the greatest contribution to mission success were often those who understood when rules needed to be bent, when procedures needed to be modified, when standard operating procedures needed to be supplemented by professional judgment that couldn't be codified in manual. Asa demonstrated that judgment during her unauthorized supply mission, and Harrison's decision to protect her had been vindicated by her subsequent performance. She had learned from the experience without being broken by it, had incorporated the lessons into her standard operations without repeating the risks that had made the lesson necessary. The fight report would remain in the archives as a reminder that military effectiveness sometimes required tolerance for actions that couldn't be officially approved, but couldn't be officially condemned. It was the compromise that allowed exceptional people to contribute their best efforts to missions that mattered, while maintaining the discipline necessary for large-scale military operations. Sun initialed the final page of the report and placed it in the classified filing system, where it would remain until historians decades in the future attempted to understand how military objectives had been achieved through methods that didn't appear in official records. Then, the people involved would have retired or died, their contributions measured by outcomes rather than procedures, by results rather than compliance with regulations that had been written for different circumstances and different challenges. The report disappeared into bureaucratic darkness, but the lessons it documented continued to influence decisions made by leaders who understood that rules were tools for achieving objectives rather than obstacles to accomplishing mission. Voss received her promotion to lieutenant colonel during a ceremony that recognized her exceptional service record and her contribution to air-ground coordination improvements that had enhanced mission effectiveness across multiple theaters. The promotion came with assignment to training command, where her experience would be used to prepare the next generation of close air support pilots for the realities of combat operations. Assignment was both recognition of her expertise and removal from operational environment, where her judgment might again conflict with established procedure. It was a common career path for exceptional pilots, whose value to the military extended beyond their ability to execute assigned mission, transferred to positions where their knowledge could be shared without the risks associated with independent operation. She understood the implications of her promotion and accepted them without complaint. Teaching would allow her to influence hundreds of pilots rather than supporting dozens of ground units, multiplying her contribution to military effectiveness while reducing the likelihood of situations that required choosing between regulations and results. First lecture to student pilots would focus on the importance of understanding mission purpose rather than merely executing mission parameters. She would emphasize the need to develop judgment that could be applied when standard procedures were insufficient, when circumstances required improvisation that couldn't be covered in training manuals. Job is not to follow orders, she would tell them during their final week of training. Your job is to accomplish mission. Sometimes those objectives align perfectly, and your success will be measured by compliance with established procedures. Sometimes they conflict, and your success will be measured by your ability to achieve results that matter more than the methods you use to achieve them. It would be controversial among some instructors who prefer to emphasize adherence to chain of command and respect for established procedures. But Voss had earned the credibility to challenge conventional approaches, and her students would graduate with a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between authority and responsibility, between following orders and accomplishing objectives. So the log entry for the day of her promotion would be typically brief. Received promotion to lieutenant colonel, assigned to train command, honored to contribute to the development of few combat pilots. But the entry would mark the end of one phase of her career and the beginning of another, from someone who had learned to make difficult decisions in isolation to someone who could teach others to make similar decisions with better preparation and support. Transformation was complete. From pilot to leader, from someone who bent rules to someone who taught others when rule bending was appropriate, from individual contributor to force multiplier who would influence military operations for decades through the pilots she trained. Years after the Minute supply drop, a documentary filmmaker researching untold stories of military heroism received an anonymous tip about irregularities in supply operations during the Afghan conflict. The tip included dates, locations, and personnel errors that suggested certain forward operating bases had received supplies through channels that weren't reflected in official logistics records. Filmmaker Mari Santos had built her reputation on investigating stories that revealed the human dimension of military operations, the individual decisions that shaped major outcomes, the personal courage that compensated for institutional failures, the unsung heroes whose contributions were measured in lives saved rather than medals awarded. Initial research confirmed that multiple isolated units had survived siege conditions despite a official record showing no supply deliveries during critical periods. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, too widespread to be explained by clerical errors, too successful to be the result of luck or exceptional resource management. Her attempts to interview personnel from the affected units had yielded only vague acknowledgments of exceptional leadership and innovative logistics solutions. No one was willing to discuss specific incidents or identify individuals who had provided support during critical moments. The conspiracy of silence was complete and impenetrable. Investigation had reached a dead end when she received a second anonymous communication. A single photograph of an A-10 aircraft silhouetted against the dawn sky, with coordinates that matched the location of forward operating base Viper 7 during the period when Captain Reeves had commanded the isolated unit. The graph had been taken from the ground, showing the distinct profile of the aircraft as it climbed away from what appeared to be a successful supply drop. The image quality exhibited had been captured by someone with access to professional equipment, someone who had been expecting the aircraft's arrival, someone who understood the significance of documenting an event that would never appear in official records. To studied the photograph with the trained eye of someone who had learned to extract truth from fragments of evidence. The aircraft bore no visible identification markings. The pilot's identity was concealed by the cockpit configuration. The location could have been anywhere in Afghanistan, where American forces operated isolated forward position. The photograph told a story that transcended its technical limitations. Someone with access to military aircraft had risked court-martial to deliver supplies to soldiers who had been abandoned by conventional logistics systems. The image captured a moment of individual courage that had prevented a tragedy, preserved lives that would have been lost to bureaucratic indifference, and demonstrated leadership that couldn't be taught in any military academy. It was realized that the photograph was both the key to her investigation and the reason her investigation could never be completed. The anonymous source had provided evidence of heroism that could never be acknowledged without destroying the people who had made it possible. The story that needed to be told was the same story that had to remain secret to protect its protagonists. The documentary would eventually focus on the broader theme of individual initiative during military operations, using the anonymous photograph as a symbol of courage that existed in the spaces between official recognition and necessary action. She would never identify the pilot or the sick units that had benefited from unauthorized support, but she would create a framework for understanding how exceptional results were achieved through methods that couldn't be officially proved. Would be nominated for several awards and would inspire a generation of military personnel to consider their responsibilities to mission accomplishment rather than merely procedural compliance. But its greatest impact would be unmeasurable. The reinforcement of cultural values that prioritize results over recognition, service over self-interest, and the welfare of fellow service members over personal career advancement. Catalina Voss, now Lieutenant Colonel Voss, would watch the documentary during a private screening arranged by colleagues who recognized certain familiar themes in Santos' narrative. She would say nothing during the film or the discussion that followed, maintaining the operational security that had protected everyone involved in the incident that had inspired her investigation. At night, in the privacy of her quarters, she would add a final entry to the personal log that documented her most meaningful military experiences. Watch the documentary about anonymous heroism during military operations. Reminded of the importance of service that seeks no recognition and expects no reward beyond the knowledge that actions taken in good conscience can change outcomes that matter. It would be followed by a blank page, marking the end of one chapter in her career and the beginning of another. The midnight supply drop had transformed her understanding of leadership and responsibility, but it would remain forever in the classified portions of her memory, shared with no one, acknowledged by no system, recognized by no authority except the soldiers whose lives had been preserved by decisions that couldn't be officially proved. The story had ended where it began. In silence, in darkness, in the spaces between regulations and results where individual conscience turned, or their impossible mission became possible through courage that asked for nothing except the opportunity to make a difference when differences mattered most. Colonel Voss retired from the Air Force after 23 years of service, her record distinguished by innovation in close air support tactics, exceptional pilot training outcomes, and contributions to air-ground coordination protocols that had improved mission effectiveness across multiple combat theaters. Her farewell ceremony was attended by dozens of pilots she had trained, officers she had mentored, and ground force commanders who credited her with developing air support capabilities that had saved countless lives. Citations and commendations that marked her career told the official story of professional excellence. Combat missions completed successfully, training objectives exceeded consistently, leadership responsibilities discharged with exceptional competence. But the complete story of her service would never appear in any official record, protected by operational security requirements that would outlive everyone involved in the incidents that defined her most important contribution. Retirement was marked by the establishment of the Voss Fellowship, a program that provided advanced training opportunities for pilots who demonstrated the combination of technical proficiency and moral courage that had characterized her approach to military service. The fellowship would be funded through private donations from former students and colleagues who understood that her influence extended far beyond the mission she had flown or the regulations she had followed. And criteria for the fellowship emphasized judgment over compliance, initiative over adherence to procedure, and the willingness to accept responsibility for outcomes that transcended individual performance metrics. It was designed to identify and develop pilots who could be trusted to make difficult decisions in circumstances where guidance from higher authority was unavailable or insufficient. Pilots would serve on the selection committee, evaluating candidates through interviews that probed their understanding of the relationship between authority and responsibility, between following orders and accomplishing objectives, between career advancement and service to others. Her questions would be designed to identify people who possess